Look at that, right on cue. And look at that, I lifted up the microphone. Thank you, Laura. All right. I didn't do a script at the DIA, and I thought better of it after failing to fall asleep last night, so. I know, I'm super pro. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Cranbrook. I want to thank you for driving out for this special evening. My name's Chris Fraser. I'm artist in residence and head of photography here at Cranbrook. Woo, yeah. If you haven't drunk the Kool-Aid, what that means is that I run the graduate photography department here, and you will get to see my students later on. So we gather here this evening for a lecture by Sheida Solomani, an internationally exhibited artist, an associate professor of art, and an alumna of the Cranbrook Photography Department circa 2015. Following her lecture, I encourage you to get food from the food truck Tacos Hernandez on the Knoll Walkway, and then to take your food up to the Graduate Photography Department and enjoy an evening with us, enjoy open studios with my students and time with each other. We'll have beverages available to you. You're going to want to follow the pink signs. We've got two of them. One of them is going to greet you as you exit up the ramp and tell you to go left. The other one's going to show you where to turn right and walk in. I swear you will get there eventually. But back to Sheida. Through photography, film, performance, and sculpture, Sheida Solomani offers both a poignant analysis of image building in the contemporary media landscape and a critical view on international politics and its power relationships. Source images from press and social media are transformed into stage sets and documented with the camera. As unspoken truths are turned towards the grotesque and confrontational and overtly patchwork scenes, Solomani sheds light on the coded ways that messages, political and otherwise, are disseminated in a global context while satirizing both East and West. In doing so, she unveils a barely covered up reality that is no less surreal than the images constructed in her studio. A daughter of political refugees persecuted by the Iranian government in the 1980s, Solomani's practice explores the intersection of art and activism. Solomani recently exhibited her work in solo exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, Photo Forum Pasqua in Switzerland, Providence College Galleries, and Castello San Basilio in Italy. Her exhibition, Medium of Exchange, was shown at Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, Atlanta Contemporary, and Q Arts Foundation in New York, among others. In 2019, she had a solo exhibition at the Southern Utah Museum of Art and participated in the De Cordova Biennial in Lincoln, Massachusetts. In 2022, Solomani presented a monumental version of her work, Masa, at the Eyes of Iran project at New York's FDR for Freedom State Park. In 2025, she won the Massed Photography Grant on Industry, you're busy, on Industry and Work with her series Flyways. Her work has been recognized internationally in both exhibitions and publications such as Art Forum, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, Interview Magazine, and Hyperallergic. Solomani resides in Providence, Rhode Island, where she is Associate Professor of Art at Brandeis University. Please help me welcome Sheida Solomani.
I'm going to try to bend this down. Y'all can hear me? All right, I'm going to give you a few heads up. I cuss a lot, so I'm going to say fuck like every other word. I'm really informal. I was asked to give a description of my talk, and I just didn't know how to reply. I'm so sorry, Chris. I just was like, that sounds too academic. I'm just going to talk about my work, so that's what we're going to do today. And I will be giving you a few trigger warnings because I am working with individuals that have been brutalized by the Islamic totalitarian regime in Iran. I am going to be showing a few images of individuals that are deceased. I will let you know ahead of time when those images are coming up on the screen. But first and foremost, thank you, Chris, for inviting me to be here. I'm so stoked to be back at Cranbrook. It's really interesting being on this side of the podium and not in the audience. But I'm just gonna jump right in. And because I'm really informal, like you can just like kind of yell at me and ask questions during the process of this. All right, so I'm gonna go. All right, so everything Chris said is true. I am the daughter of Iranian political refugees. My parents, were anti-Shah as well as anti-Ayatollah, and because of their political activism, they were both leftist Marxists. My father had a bounty on his head. He was in hiding for many years. He was imprisoned and then escaped, took a long journey over the mountains on horseback. My mother also tried to escape, and she was caught at the border and put in solitary confinement for over a year, where she was also subsequently tortured. So these are stories that I grew up with. And I grew up in Ohio, in like soy and corn fields, where no one else looked like us or spoke like us. I didn't speak English until I was about 10. And there's like a real reckoning with like American public education system and learning about world history and recognizing that my history wasn't part of that, or our family's history wasn't part of that, or Swana regional history was not part of that. And so I always was like, all right, where's this huge gap? I'm hearing all of these things from my parents about where we're from and what they faced. And so when I'd go to school and I'd talk about my parents, my mom, being imprisoned, people would be like, oh, so was your mom like a murderer? Like, did she steal something? And I was like, no, she was like a political prisoner. And I realized that the difference between like incarceration, here and incarceration there are like wildly just so different. Also both terribly bad, obviously, but. So that kind of like in undergrad, I was trying to make like personal work. I had all white faculty members. They really didn't know how to support me. It was when internet art became like trendy. And a professor of mine encouraged me to not make work that was personal because I wouldn't be able to get people to understand it because they hadn't had those experiences. And my experiences were too niche. And so I should try making more broad global work. And so I remember getting into Cranbrook, talking to Liz Cohen on the phone and being like, okay, this woman seems great. And like, she's interested in having these conversations. But I was like, okay, going to grad school means that I have to be like professional, right? So I threw away my freezer full of dead animals, and I vowed to never use any dead animals in my work or live animals in my work ever again. And that I was only going to be making work that was more quote unquote global and less personal. And so I got to Cranbrook. This is the first piece I ever made when I was at Cranbrook. I was like, okay, I really want to talk about all of these issues. I want to talk about Iran. I want to talk about the greater Swana region. And I want to talk about, the economy that is so dominated by oil. I started thinking about the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, founded in 1962 at the Baghdad Conference. Iran is one major member. OPEC basically is like all of the global like oil countries. And if you look at the history of all of those countries, you'll notice that every single one of them have US interventionism. So this was my attempt to make a photo of the GDP of Iran. This is my first like quote unquote portrait. 98% of the trade is oil. The other 2% is agricultural, and it's all tainted by that. It's pomegranates, pistachios, rice. And so this was like my first still life. And I remember I made it and I was like, oh my God, this is great. Like, I'm so excited. Like, I love grad school. And then I remember showing it to my Baba, and he was like, Baba, this is too pretty. This means nothing. And I was like, okay, I guess I have to go harder. So I started thinking about color, at the same time I was like talking to painters, and they're all looking at their little color wheels, and it just felt so like vapid, and I didn't know what to do with that. I mean, obviously color matters, but I started thinking about political color, and I started thinking about color revolutions. So the Soviets in the 50s kind of invented this idea that if you ascribe color to a political party, it makes it a lot easier for people to just kind of like latch on to that idea without knowing what it is. So like, think about an election, around the corner. You like your neighbors that you live in a neighborhood with on each side, and you're like, oh yeah, like Joe that lives on the right-hand side's like a nice guy, Sue that lives on the left is nice. They both have these signs that say vote yes for issue 4 in their yard. And you're, a relatively researched person, you'd like to think, and you go to the polls, and you've researched all those other things, but you forgot to research what issue 4 was. And so you get to the polls, and you're like, okay, well, I saw vote yes for issue 4 next door, and both sides, and I think those people are like, relatively left-leaning, so I'm going to vote yes for issue 4. And you kind of make a blind decision. Color revolutions work very similarly to that. So then I started trying to make work that was more like punk rock, DIY, in your face, like whatever. So I was thinking about the history of political parties. Here, party supplies hint at the doctrines of political parties. I'll be talking about the Green Revolution, or Iran's quote-unquote Twitter revolution, in a moment. There was a time after the Green Revolution in which Ahmadinejad spoke and said there are no gay people in Iran. I would like to inform you that that's not true. And I was thinking a lot about this idea or this term of the Arab Spring, and which I think is a really actually racist, like fucked up term. First off, it was lumping all of these Swana countries into one region that were vaguely, Arab. Iran is not Arab. And then kind of ascribing and lumping all of their revolutions together without recognizing the reasons why all of these governments were toppling and people were unhappy. And so the green color comes from that. You have Ahmadinejad, you have the cracked eggs, you have the spring. We have this, festival called Nowruz. It's a holiday, which means new day or new year. It's the coming of the new year. And you set the table with 7 things that remind you of the beginning of spring. Sumac is one of those. So I made this piece. I remember I showed it in HQ, I hung it at the wall, and I threw a whole carton of eggs at the wall. It smelled disgusting. And I was like, getting into really trying to make controversial work. And this was a moment in crit where we had a cold crit. And one of the people in the crit room, first few minutes of cold crit, you don't talk. You let everyone else talk. And then at the end, you tell them what it's about. And someone was like, oh my God, that has to be her dad. Like, she totally has daddy issues, right? Like, this is a daddy issues piece. Like, it's a confession of, like, father trauma piece. And I was like, oh God, like, you can't say anything. And then the second person in the room was like, no, that's Larry David. This is a party scene for Larry David. And that was really just the moment where I was like, wow, people don't have any idea of political figures or any currency of what's happening outside of this country. To think that this is my father or Larry David when this was the president of Iran is just so wild to me. But it really shows the illiteracy. And that illiteracy is something that I am really fascinated now because of that moment, because of that crit. So I was like, okay, I guess political work can't be using political figures, so how can I dumb this down? Which I don't encourage dumbing down, but I was, you have those grad student moments. So I started thinking about protest. My father was a freedom fighter. He still is in many ways. And so he would tell me these stories about when he was protesting on the streets of Iran and there's tear gas being thrown, which is a lacrimatory agent. He would go and take a bottle of Coca-Cola and slam it, against a wall, break it, soak a towel in the Coca-Cola and put it over his eyes, or rub onions in his eyes, because those are 2 things that prevent against tear gas. In Occupy Wall Street, in 2011, people were kind of distributing these types of posters, against how to protect yourself. And these are things that we obviously still now see on social media. But this was really the beginning of when revolution and protest and social media all came together. So I started making these weird still lives of, tear gas, or thinking about still lives that had to be charged in some way, but had some relationship to Dutch vanitas. All right, water time. All right, so that was fun. I was playing. I'm really interested in fabricating images, which we'll talk all about in a second. But then I started thinking about what are the images that I'm using? If I can't use political figures all the time, what are the stories of individuals that I'm telling? I wanted to actually communicate with people on the ground there. I remember, that professor back in undergrad telling me the work was too personal. And I was like, okay, well, one way that one can make it global, right, is by communicating with individuals that are actually living in totalitarian fear under a regime that gives them no basic human rights. And so in October of 2014, 14 women had acid thrown on their faces for not wearing their hijabs correctly. And I got in touch with a few of them, communicating with them, kind of trading stories and photos, and using, photos that they had taken of themselves that they were sending to me to kind of make these survivor testimony pieces. And I got really interested in Trojan horses. people are overwhelmed by the pornography of pain and trauma all the time. I mean, how many times are we going to see body cam footage of someone being shot, and you could rewind it and play it over and over and over, and every time that person's gonna die, but you can reanimate that trauma, and that's not useful because we are becoming so numb or so accustomed to seeing this, pornography of pain. And so I'm really interested in kind of breaking up that idea or that overwhelmingness and tricking people into dealing with difficult things by showing them something pretty. Okay, trigger warning, next image is of an individual who has been shot during a protest. This is Neda Agha Sultan in the Green Revolution. She was shot while protesting with her father and her professor. And in a 1 minute and 52-second video, you see her standing, fall to the ground, bleed out, and die. And it was kind of one of those first moments for me that body cam footage, was like something that was like in my periphery, like something that I had seen and I kept on watching over and over and didn't know what to make of it. Because I was like, how is this happening? How is this recorded? How is nothing changing? What are we doing about this? Protests sprung out all across the country and they were brutally stamped out. But this was really kind of just like a mobilization point for me. This was on American TV. I was 18 when this happened, and this was on American TV for probably 2-3 days, and then Michael Jackson died, and then the news completely forgot. So I wanted to make an image of her. I took a screen grab of her face every 10 seconds of the video, thinking about this kind of like ascension. You'll see a lot of ladders in my newer work as well. Bricks with the mortar of the country being oil, and the symbol of the sugar cube or sugar, which comes in my work a lot too. My mom told me a story once about how when you sacrifice a lamb in Iran, you place a sugar cube in its mouth before you slit its throat to make it happy before you end its life. And she has always equated that to revolution in the country. It's this kind of pacification, because every time we feel like something's happening, and then it's brutally stamped out by the regime. This is Rehana Jabari. She was executed October 24th, 2014 for protecting herself against her rapist. So under Islamic law, women have really no rights at all under Sharia law. And so I started making these still lives. I would not make this work again. I'm really glad I made it in grad school. It's really important for me thinking about photography and consent. I always make this joke that photography is a male-dominated genre, a white male-dominated genre, in which the lens is a dick that non-consensually penetrates the world. And what does it mean to create a practice that's consensual? Are you communicating with your subjects? Are you blindly taking or capturing images of them? And so in this, project, I was really making sure to be in touch with, families of victims or individuals to make sure it was okay that I use their photographs. And if you're wondering how they're made, they're really shitty. They're constantly falling apart. They're made tabletop out of this was grad school, so there's lots of objects from Value World in there. That was like my playground. And paper and tar, everything I owned was covered in tar. But they're lit with really fucking hot lighting. So if you're thinking about seduction, think product photography. I was looking at Better Homes and Gardens. I was looking at Vogue. I was looking at how people were shooting Prada purses and thinking about how I could bring those strategies into photographing my work to make it seductive and palatable. All right, so I graduated Cranbrook. I got an ACAD fellowship. I was placed at RISD. I was the quote-unquote diversity fellow. It was one of the craziest experiences in my life because, being a student in academia, that academia fucking blows. But being on the other side of academia and teaching in academia, you're like, wow, this shit's really fucked up and institutions really suck. And I didn't know what to make of it. I was I was 25, I was teaching for the first time ever, and I had all these students that were like, all of our white professors don't understand our work, and they won't talk about it, and I was getting angry, and I was like, how dare you white professors not talk about it, because I was all charged. Anyways, it was really intense, and I love teaching, and I met some of the most incredible students, but I became very disillusioned very quickly, and I kind of have a vendetta against academia, even though I'm technically part of it still. And so I was also told at that time that if I wanted to quote unquote make it in the art world, I had to be in the studio all the time. So I would go teach my 4/4 load, which was not sustainable as a 25-year-old. And then I would go home to my house in my garage where I set up a studio and I would make work. And so I was thinking about what I made in grad school. I thought a lot about what was missing. And what was missing was my mom, her stories. My mom was in solitary for a whole entire year. She is deeply traumatized. She talks about it constantly. My whole upbringing, she would make drawings of her solitary confinement cell on like the tablecloths of an Olive Garden, like where the kids get the crayons and you're supposed to draw on the paper tablecloths. She would take the crayons and she would draw her solitary cell on there. And so I was like, okay, I've been talking with all of these people, thinking about survivor testimony. Why am I not thinking about the women who are, basically being disappeared, who are being consigned to oblivion? And so I started thinking about observational psych. In 1962, Albert Banderas, who's the same person that did the lovely wire monkey experiment, did his first iteration of the Bobo doll experiment. If you don't know what a Bobo doll is, it's like a punching bag that's weighted on the bottom. You push it and it kind of comes back up at you. And so the very, very early iteration of this experiment, there's 2 test groups of kids, 20 kids in each group. The first 20 kids gets to go into this room that's filled with toys, just objects of all sorts. Legos or whatever, toys were trendy at that time, coloring things like toy guns, balls, whatever. I don't know what kids play with, but the room was filled with kids' toys. And they just got to go in and they were observed, and most of them played with everything except for the Bobo doll. So then the second group of kids goes into this room, but before they go into this room, they all watch this video. And this video is of an adult model, you see her in the very top, behaving aggressively against the Bobo doll. She's punching it, she's dragging it, she's sitting on it, she holds up a gun. It's not rocket science, kids are sponges. So every single one of them that went into that room, did that same exact behavior. So I started thinking about how Iranian government endorses aggression on women. And these women that had been consigned to oblivion basically became these punching bags. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I have 80 slides and we're only on 15. So I started kind of printing their forms on fabric, putting them in these scenes, thinking about their cases. I was in touch with all of their families. They shared images with me. This is actually the only mother in the series. Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani is the mother of Rehana Jabari. So she shared a lot of images with me of her and her daughter. This is her visiting her daughter's grave, even though she doesn't have her daughter's body. This is Rehana Jabari as she's being sentenced to death. And then I was asked by the new museum to do this project called The Download, considering how this information could be distributed and organized on a desktop. And so it's a kind of nesting series of folders, and as you open each folder has a title, and it's a line from her last letter before she's executed. And you also subsequently learn about the execution records of all of these other women. But I also started thinking about, where does art belong? Like, we're all really fucking lucky to be sitting here right now. Like, Cranbrook ain't cheap, unless you get one of those presidential scholarships. I had to take out student loans to be here. To be an artist is a political choice, I think, especially in an economy that is so challenging and jobs are basically impossible to get. And, to be able to go to an academic institution, to be able to go to college, that's really pretty crazy. If you really think about it, everyone should be allowed this right, but they're not. And so who gets to see art? The elite. Who gets to see art and has time to see art? People that are part of the art world or part of academia or in some sort of intelligentsia. And is that you always are gonna get asked this in crit, who's your audience? Who's your target audience? Who do you want to see your work? And I always thought about who I grew up with. The public education system in Ohio that never taught me anything about a country outside of America, unless it was Europe. We learned about Europe too. But, I was thinking a little bit about, why am I not reaching those people? How do we make open source art? And so part of this project was providing these files at very high res like full res files to anyone who wanted to download them and reproduce them as like a zine or as posters or to have them or to learn about them. But to be able to have them, you have to unnest the whole entire series of folders. Anyways, that project was really fucking heavy. I remember it was 2016 at the time, and my students at RISD were like, "Oh my God, Sheida, like, what do you do for self-care?" And I was like, "What the fuck is this self-care? I'm raised by like immigrants. Like, we don't do that shit. Like, what are you doing? Like facials? Are you like doing your nails? Like," and I didn't know what to do with myself because this was, I was literally like sewing the formless bodies of these executed women and like sewing them with a needle, and it just felt really intense. And so I started thinking about humor. I'm not showing it here because there's just not enough time, but I made this whole entire series of work that was about like OPEC being this like queer BDSM, like politics, like oil being the like lubricant of corruption and cronyism. It's really gay. It's a lot of politicians' faces. And it was really fun to make, and I needed that as an offset. But again, there's not time. So just like take care of yourselves. I'm saying this as I'm traveling every single day out of this month, but hopefully I'll take care of myself soon. It's really important. You're not going to last and you're not going to make work if you don't take care of your body and your mind. In December of 2020, it was January 2020, I was sitting at a bar in Texas, in Marfa, Texas, and I saw my last name flash across the screen, and I was like, fuck, that's not gonna be good. And that was because Trump had assassinated Qasem Soleimani. And so I started like being like, fuck, like this is gonna be crazy. Like, are people gonna think I'm a terrorist again? Because 9/11 was pretty tough. And it was another one of those moments where I wish I could say that I wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised. I started getting these texts from friends that were like, and friends that I thought were intelligent individuals. "Oh my God, Sheida, I'm so sorry for your loss. Is your family okay? Is everyone okay?" And I was just like, what? What do you mean, is everyone okay? And they're like, well, Qasem Soleimani. And I remember calling my Baba and being like, Baba, these people think that we're related. And, the same way that when we were, in Ohio during 9/11, my father told me to contend with this nonsense with humor. When people said, does your dad know Saddam Hussein? I would say, yes, he plays backgammon with him regularly, because Persians don't play chess, we play backgammon. And so the same way I would say, oh yes, Uncle Qasem was very near and dear to me, thank you so much. And it really started getting me to think a lot and getting angry again about all of the same things that I came into grad school with. So in this piece, I'm thinking about, this is when I started the series Levers of Power. It's ongoing. I'm thinking about hand gestures of politicians. I actually hired an FBI-trained body language coach who taught me about political gesture and how people read it. And so one of these hands is Trump, and the other hand is Rouhani, but I'm never going to tell you which one is which, because it's so much about blame shifting. Who's quote-unquote good and who's bad? Well, both of them fucking suck, so does it really matter who's good or worse? You have the war hawk, and this is when the birds really started creeping back in my work. They're kind of everywhere now. But, I started thinking about the war hawk and the peace dove, how we ascribe these symbols to these sentient beings, the white flag, the black flag, all in the meanwhile, while all of the source images in the back are images of PS-752, which is a Ukrainian air jet that was shot down by an Iranian missile. And then COVID happened, and the health minister of Iran came on TV, and he's feverishly just sweating and giving this speech as he's sweating and wiping his brow, being like, there's no COVID in Iran at all. Everything's fine. He was positive. The next day, he tested positive. And so, meanwhile, everyone's like, oh, there's no COVID in Iran? What are these satellite images of mass graves with lime powder being deposited in them? Well, there's so many people dying. They were just, throwing people into pits and covering them with lime powder. This is Behisht Zahra Cemetery, which is one of the largest cemeteries. And then thinking about, how politics and activists, politicians and activists kind of entangle. So this is Ruhollah Azam, who is an activist that ran this news channel where he taught people to make Molotov cocktails. He was lured back into the country and assassinated, and he was charged with corruption on earth, which is the title of this piece. The New York Post had this really kind of hilarious front page of like, is Qasem Soleimani really dead? And they showed a photo of his hand, his like dismembered hand after he was killed on the lawn. And they were like, this ring doesn't look like this ring that's on his hand in life. And so I started kind of like thinking about that a lot, and like the kind of, you know, just like fantastical like quality of how ridiculous this all is, and how can I bring that confusion into my work. And then, of course, in 2022, Mahsa Zina Amini, a Kurdish woman, was attacked and murdered in Iran for not wearing her hijab correctly. Iranian government still to this day says that she had a heart attack, but the hospital leaked her brain scans, and I'm not a doctor, but that looks like some blunt force trauma to the head. And so at the United Nations, for Eyes on Iran, this was a 24-foot billboard that looked directly at the United Nations, with her hand, you know, in life, holding a white hijab for White Wednesdays. It's burning. That was something that women would do to protest the government at the time. The same government that's in power today. Okay, so that's a lot. It was really dark. It was intense. COVID was still going on as I was like making that. It's still kind of going on, honestly, but you know, I digress. And I started thinking at the end of COVID, I'm kind of like a disaster thinker. COVID happened. My parents are essential workers. My father works in a hospital, and he sees patients, and he runs free clinics. And so I was convinced that they were going to die. I was like, in the end of 2020, I started thinking about making work again, and you know, thinking about how my parents aren't going to be here and how I felt so guilty, because I was like, they're going to die. I'm never going to have told their story because I've been too scared ever since undergrad to make work about them. And I called them and I asked them, hey, you're going to die and I'm going to die. So will you let me take photographs of you and tell your story? Because my dad in the early 2000s would always talk about how he wanted to hire a ghostwriter to like write about his life. There was like this kind of moment where like all these immigrants were getting these books published about their lives that were like written by someone else. My dad, when I was a kid, would be like, Baba, one day I should do that. I should talk to a ghostwriter. I'd be like, yeah, whatever, Baba, you're not gonna do that. And it was true, he never did. So when COVID came around and I was convinced that he was gonna die, I called him with a proposition. I said, look, you're gonna die, I'm gonna die. You've never had your story ghostwritten, can I do it? And he said yes, under a few conditions. You can photograph me and your mother as long as A, our faces are completely covered. My father's is a little bit more important to be covered than my mother's because, you know, she will never go back to the country, but he's still very politically active. Second was that this was a kind of series of works that we would collaborate on. I would not be making unilateral decision. And my parents have always been a huge part of my work. I've always talked to them about every single decision I've made in my work. And my dad will question every decision and be like, why is this like this? And no, you got that date wrong. And yes, you have to change this. And my mom will always be like, oh, like you're talking about death? Like, okay, here are some symbols you could use, like, let's not use a skull, let's think about synonyms for skulls. And so like we've always had this like relationship with one another. So I said, okay, collaborative, masks, and they said, and if you take the photo and we don't like it, you're not allowed to show it. And I said, okay, deal. So we all got our vaccines and things got a little easier, kind of, and they came for their first visit and we made photos. And so in the meantime, I was gathering things from the archive. This is a drawing that my mom made in 2013, way before COVID and, you know, way before any of this happened. She's always described her life to me by making drawings. It's kind of a way for her to work through her trauma, but she also really likes making art, which is really great. So this is the house she grew up in. There were walls on all, like, you know, four sides and a courtyard in the middle. It's a very like typical kind of mud house where she grew up in Shiraz. And she marked all of these rooms, like the room, the morgue amak, which is where they would store their rice. You kind of see here. That's a room that my father went into hiding in the first time. He hid under bags of rice when the Sepah, or the guards, came to find him. There's all of these trees that were part of her father's garden where she buried 7 dead babies in jars. When she worked at a Kurdish field hospital, she delivered babies that were affected by chemical warfare. and were stillborn or born with birth defects. And because she was young and she didn't know what to do, she preserved them in formaldehyde. And when she had to escape the country, she buried every single one under these trees in her house. And so she made this map for me when I was 23 of if I ever go to Iran, where to find every single one of these babies and to give them a proper burial. This is one of the trees that one of them is supposedly buried under, and that's the house. And so I've been working a lot with this archive of what I have. They escaped the country, not with much, but with a little bit, with some photos, with their passports. And this is really like something I think about, like the documents that individuals need to have to like give proof that they're permitted to be somewhere. So admitted as a refugee. And I started thinking about how my practice has always been layering and building and constructing these tableaus. And I do that, especially thinking about, I'm sure a lot of you have read Alan Sekula's Body in the Archive, thinking about phrenology, physiognomy, stereotyping, how we look at portraits of people. I've hated portraiture for the longest time, and the fact that I'm doing it feels really fucking crazy to me. But I hate it because we oftentimes reduce bodies to what we see and what we're societally conditioned to recognize. That could be race, that could be gender, that could be class, that could be place. And all of those things really bother me because we're so reductive. And so I'm really interested in making these narratives, so layered and so complex that there is no clear answer, that you have to kind of dig to find this information. So these are archival images of the house that my mom grew up in, the ruins of it. Her masked, my father masked. And this kind of opens the series. The series is called Ghostwriter, by the way. One of the drawings of my mom's solitary confinement cell from an Olive Garden tablecloth that I kept from when I was a little kid. And then I remade it. And kind of thinking of working with my mother, in this way where we're kind of doing this cathartic kind of rebuilding of this together. When we were making this photo, she was standing up and putting her hands in the painted rays of light. And she would say, there was only one window in the cell and the light would only come in one direction. And she said, when I was cold, I'd put my hands in the light because the light would warm my hands up. And so this was a 4-hour-long kind of moment where we were in this kind of paper cell together, building and constructing. On the top of the ladder, you see a little fish crow. So what I haven't mentioned yet is that when I was trying to do self-care when I was 25, I went to therapy for the first time in my life, a little late. And my therapist asked me what makes me happy. And I told her, I think, the art world's a racket, academia fucking blows. But I used to do this thing with my mom when I was growing up, which was rehabbing animals, rehabilitating wild animals. My mom was a nurse back in our home country, and it was the true joy of her life. She loved caring for people and caring for things. And when she came to the States and she could no longer do that, that joy was really taken from her. And so because we were in Ohio and because roadkill is every Ohioan's favorite pastime is hitting animals, she would find these half-dead, half-alive animals and she would bring them into the house. And my father would bring home medical equipment from his office, and our suburban kitchen island turned into this surgical suite that was for these animals that most of the time would die, but every once in a while would live. And I became accustomed to death at a very young age in that way, because my mom would be like, oh, it died, but that's normal, that happens, here's its dead body, look at it. And so when I got to Rhode Island and I was like, why am I so anxious all the time? My therapist said, well, why don't you get back into wildlife rehab? So I took that very seriously, and within a week, I started volunteering at a wildlife rehab org, and within 2 or 3 months, I started taking continuing ed classes, and now I'm federally licensed and certified, and I run my own bird clinic in Rhode Island where we take upwards of 2,000 birds every year and return a lot of them back to the wild. So that is where the birds started coming back into the work. So this crow is a patient of mine that, I think a lot about sentience and the non-human and this idea of animal-human collaboration that we just make such a, it's so, stupid. There is no animal-human collaboration. These animals, we project on them constantly. When they come into my care, it's like they've been abducted into some, alien, X-Files situation, and I'm poking them and prodding them, and it's not consensual. They can't tell me what their pain scale is or what hurts or what doesn't. They don't know that I'm helping them. So I think a lot about the clinic as being like, or the hospital as being a form of a prison. And when my mom was in solitary, she told me, you know, as we've been working on the series together, there's a lot that she's been remembering and has been coming out. And so she told me, she remembered after we made that piece of her in the cell, that she wrote a poem when she was in solitary. It's the only poem she's ever written. And she was kept in Hoi, which is a, you know, prison on the border where she was trying to escape. And so I kind of remade her prison cell out of the photo of the prison itself, her hands emerging from the cell, and, you know, holding this Eastern bluebird that I rehabilitated. And then right on top of the poem is right on top of the photograph is screen printed the poem which she wrote about being a trapped bird, a caged bird that's been forgotten about. This is the first exhibition of that series of work at PCG. So I'm really interested, I hate shit on white walls. I'm really interested in transforming galleries into like theatrical spaces. I think a lot about screenplays and queer cinema. I love Jack Smith. I love the campiness of like using a cast of your friends and making things DIY and like kind of just building worlds. And so on the floor and on the walls are the drawings of my mom's house that she grew up in. I'm going to flip through these pretty quickly. This is Safar and Taroto, testaments to my parents as freedom fighters. And then the birds obviously come back in. Every single one of these has a story, but we don't have time for me to get into them, so I'm just going to flip through them quickly. This is called What a Revolutionary Must Know. One of my lullabies when I was a kid was a protest song, a Persian protest song, called Ye Jangal Sitare Dare, and it's really about a protest song about how the tulips in the mountains are revolutionaries, and when the tulips die in the winter, the bulbs actually increase underground, and every spring more and more tulips come back, and the resistance continues. And so this is like kind of the anthem of my dad's life, kind of became mine. Safekeeping, so thinking about my mom and her caretaking, and those are some of the birds that I care for in my clinic. Those are American robins. Thinking about myth, also like all of these stories that my mom tells me, I don't know what's real, what's not, what's true, what isn't. So that's a drawing that she made for me of this fruit that I've never been able to find called a batabi. She says it's not a pomelo, but I can't figure out what it is. It's some bumpy citrus fruit. It's quite large. Drawings that my dad made of his escape over the mountains, him playing chess in the mountains in a safe house he was in. And this is kind of like, okay, so like I should probably talk about like artists having crises. Like I second guess myself all the fucking time. I make a lot of work and I don't show a lot of that work. But I made this piece, which is a piece I've wanted to make my whole entire life. And now I'm like totally having this crisis where I'm like, I could never make anything ever again because it just won't be good because I love this piece. So I don't know. It's like just saying like, you'll go through this shit and hopefully I'll get out of it. But we all will, I think, hopefully. So this is my father. He escaped over the mountains on a horse. This is a life-size horse. I made hand screen printed fabric at the Fabric Workshop and Museum. You're probably noticing a lot of these checkerboard kind of patterns. I'm thinking a lot about the ancient game of snakes and ladders. It's a Persian game. It's a game of luck and chance. You know, you climb the ladder, you succeed, but then you get bitten by the snake and you fall back down to the bottom. And I think about snakes and ladders as this kind of games of luck and chance that refugees and immigrants have to play to come to this country. And so that's really become a huge thematic thing in this body of work. So I hand screen printed this fabric, upholstered this entire horse, had my dad ride the horse, paper machéed mountains, and made this piece. It's 7 feet tall by 9 feet wide. It's quite large. The snake kind of becoming this antagonist and protagonist. So I just had a show of this work. It's traveling. It's actually opening at the CAC in Cincinnati in like a week and a half. So I'll be back in the Midwest. But I kind of wanted to jump into, for the last few slides, this other life I have as a wildlife rehabilitator. It's kind of crazy, like thinking about, you know, how all these worlds collide. But if there's one thing that I could recommend to anyone, it's having like a hobby outside of making art which is not a hobby, it's a job, and outside of being an academic, which sometimes feels like a hobby, but definitely a job. And so I got really into taking care of these animals. And for a while, this was my therapy. And I resisted bringing this into my work for so long because I was like, this has to stay separate. It has to remain pure. It can't be tainted by coming into my studio. And now it is. My phone number is public. I get like upwards of 50 phone calls every day with people sending me photos of birds. Here's some of my patients. 99.9% of the birds that come into my care are maimed by human infrastructure. In Rhode Island, the fishing state, fishing line and fishing hooks become a huge part of that. So this great blue heron had osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection because of the hook being stuck in its leg for so long. There's blood in the next image if you're blood opposed. This was an owl hit by a car. This is pretty regular occurrence. Like if you're hanging out with me, like I'll probably get calls about owls like a few times a week getting hit by cars. A cormorant with lesions inside of its mouth from fishing hooks. A baby hawk with maggots in its ears. I deal with so many maggots every year. I can't even tell you. It's disgusting. And so I started thinking about this kind of like fantasy of animal-human collaboration. And it really, to me, is such a fantasy. And thinking about, you know, what is collaborative about this practice? Nothing. Like I'm trying to do the right thing, right? But the animal doesn't know that. And so this was while I started kind of putting my camera out in the bird clinic, which has kind of become my second studio. I think about like the exam as a form of choreography and recording that. So this was when I put like a backdrop behind this crow, but I was performing physical therapy on this crow because he had a shoulder injury and we had to make sure that his, you know, shoulder was rotating correctly in the socket, and he bit me the whole time. I think a lot about cropping. Cropping is your friend. Don't be too precious with your images. Crop the fuck out of them. Everyone's always like, oh, but I really want to include this little tiny moment. It probably doesn't matter. Thinking a lot about window strikes. I started shooting in film again. Like these are just so wildly different. I'm just showing you these because I think it's really important to not, like if something's successful, like Ghostwriter was probably my most successful series I've ever made. And that's crazy. To be selling artwork as an artist is actually crazy, especially as a photographer. This doesn't happen. And so I could keep making work like that the rest of my life because I know that it would sell. But that's not why I make work. I don't make work to make money. I make work because it means something to me, or it's my reaction to the world, or I want to teach, or I want to show or do something. And so making work about these birds that are so entirely maimed and fucked by human infrastructure is really important to me. But the thing is, they look nothing like my actual practice at all. And that's what I'm grappling with. You know, how do we make these images shot in film with macro, not even macro lenses, close-up kits, which are like shitty magnifying glasses screwed onto your lens? How does this become part of my practice? Does it become part of my practice? Is it important that it's part of my practice? Or is it important that it's a hobby, a quote unquote hobby, or another job, or another thing that I do? Anyways, I just had this exhibition at the International Center for Photography in New York City, and the curator really wanted me to include these photographs, and I didn't want to. I was terrified. I hated that they were so different. This is how you test for deep pain, which is how you know if a bird has or animal has a nerve response. I was just terrified to show things that were so different than my work. So I thought a lot of people ask me, why don't you ever show the backdrops? And I'm really interested in this idea of the photographer being a magician, kind of building these stages and using the camera to flatten that space and, you know, kind of make things confusing, obfuscating the truth. I mean, theoretically, cameras are supposed to be truth-telling devices, but like we all know they aren't. And so I started thinking about physical collage. Right before my mom escaped the country, she got a Canon camera, a Canon AE1, and she shot this test roll of film. And the whole entire test roll was photos of the sky right before the revolution. And she never developed that roll of film, but I guess she put it in her suitcase. And a few years ago, I found it, and I just thought it was like some old roll from the 90s. And I developed it, and it was that test roll. And so there's this idea or this metaphor for me of these birds being so harmed and so maimed by human infrastructure. What does it mean to place them back in the sky where they belong, where they'll never be again? Because every single one of these birds that you see in these images have been euthanized by me. What does it mean to hold their dying bodies in my hands as I make the decision to take their lives? And how can I layer that into all of the other work that I'm making with my parents? So these are my mom's photos and some of her drawings and the sea prints mounted on top of them. And I don't think this is the final answer, but it's just like my way of saying, like, you know, I'm trying new things, I'm experimenting. It's not the magnum opus that is my dad sitting on a horse. But there it is again. But it's good to try, and it's good to push. So yeah, these are images from my solo exhibition at ICP in New York City. It will be traveling to the Cincinnati Contemporary Art Center in 2 weeks almost. I'll be there on October 24th. And yeah, that's my last slide. Thanks so much. Any questions? What's up?
How are you able to get in contact with some of those families in Iran? Like, your connections with your parents, and like how are you able to get that?
My entire family's there. So besides my mom and my dad and my sister that I don't speak of often, my entire family's there. So yeah, connections through them and putting us in touch sometimes through the dark web. And yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Hi. Yes. Hi. Good to see you too. Oh, a microphone.
Hi.
Wow. Hi.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is just a little broader, and also just because there's so many students in the room, I'm always blown away by the way that you balance so much, whether it's your artistic practice, your rehabilitation practice, this elusive self-care. I'm curious to hear from you if you have advice for artists who want to be ambitious, but also like balance other things that they're passionate about. Part of this is just deep admiration, and how do you do all that you do?
I mean, okay, so like my number one piece of advice is to like be over eager, because I find that many of my students like don't know that they're allowed to ask for things, which is so crazy. Like when we bring artists to have studio visits with them, like I didn't like, you know, when I had studio visits in undergrad or in grad school, or when I was here at Cranbrook, like you have a studio visit, you fucking make sure you ask that artist for their email. You make sure that you keep in touch with that artist. You are an annoying brat that will never leave that artist's inbox because you had a great connection in that studio visit and you are making an effort to be in touch with them. So I think it's a lot of overeagerness, not being afraid of that, showing up places. I think there's just like, you know, I'm not saying that I think it's really important to do self-care and I should practice it more. But I think that part of existing in this crushing economy is being tireless. And I'm not saying you should be overworked, but I think that it's pushing yourself past what you know your abilities to be so you could find out where your boundaries are, because boundaries are important. But you're never going to understand what those are until you push them yourselves, if you're comfortable with doing that. And self-care, I mean, like have a hobby. Obviously, I think that's really important. Making your art cannot be your hobby. Work can never be your hobby, because then you'll never enjoy those things because they will become too much like you're forced to do them or you have to. I started making work with a film camera again because I wanted to have fun, because I was making work and I hated it. I was being in the studio and I was just like, ugh, here I am. Like, I know how to make a good still life, like A + B = C, like put it all together and it looks good, but it's didactic and it means nothing. And when you get to that point, like I know so many artists that get to that point and they're like, okay, that's like the magic sauce. Like I'm going to keep it going and I'm going to keep raking in the checks. But that like it just fries your brain. And so if you have something that like brings you joy outside of your own practice that you could turn to, or find a way to have fun in your practice again, that doesn't have to be your hobby, but to challenge yourself and to push yourself into play, I think that's it. It's play. I think always leave room for play.
Hi, thank you so much for talking. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you more about the question that your professor posed to you in, I think you said undergrad, about making personal work.
Yeah.
I think that it was interesting how you said that you eventually revisited it a little bit with your family and kind of the existential crisis that COVID was for you and everyone, obviously. But I'm curious if you've reflected on that question more as you've grown up and like matured and that kind of thing, and what that means to you as you go forward with your art.
Absolutely. So I had my first show at a gallery when I was 26, which was pretty crazy. My London gallery gave me a solo exhibition in London, and they gave me the solo exhibition with work from To Oblivion, which was crazy. Like, for a gallery to be willing to show work that is politically charged is very difficult. I remember when we were in grad school here, everyone wanted to like show with this local gallery, who I'm not going to name, but I'm sure you all know who it is. And I was like, oh my God, I want to be picked up by this gallery so bad, but they only show pretty work. And I tried making pretty work. And I remember it was like this like camouflage like piece of paper with like a flower like flopping through a hole. And I hated it. And the gallerist came into my studio and was like, oh my God, I love that image. And then I was like, I'll never work with these people. Like, don't sell your soul to make work to be pretty. But when I had my show with my London gallery, I was like, fuck, like, this is crazy. There were journalists that were speaking to me, and I had this journalist who was like a little older than me. She seemed really cool, and we were talking, and so I just like felt like I could tell her anything. And so I divulged everything about my family. I told her about my parents, how my mom was in solitary, about my father being imprisoned, about torture. And next thing I knew, 2 days later, the front page of this like magazine that she wrote for Studio International was, does anyone want to buy images of executed women? And I was so upset because I was like, this isn't what my work is about. And here I am trying to make work that is quote unquote personal, but instead it's just talking about my parents. Like, everyone wants to be close to trauma if they haven't experienced that type of trauma, right? So you tell them a story about your mom in solitary confinement, and they're like, oh my God, like, that's so crazy. And that's the reaction I was getting from people. They loved hearing these stories. And as a young artist, you want people to like love the stories you're telling. I didn't want people to use those stories as a way to like me or my work because it was so exotic to them, or because this pornography of pain was so interesting to them. And so that's why I made the decision after that show, after I made To Oblivion, that's why I made the decision to not make work with my parents, because I didn't have the ethical language to make it yet. I wasn't, mature enough, I guess. And I think it took me getting to that point of seeing, first off, journalists fucking suck. They're not responsible. It's really hard to find someone that's going to actually ask you good interview questions. Most of the time they're slop. And it took me a really long time to like realize that and become confident enough in myself and my ethics to be able to make, this work the way that I found ethical, or the way that I wanted to make. Yeah.
Okay, this is an icky question.
No such thing.
But I kind of want to ask it anyway. I'm just really curious how, and I feel like this is also like a hypocritical question, because you could make work about all kinds of things and sell it all day long. But
Sure.
when you're making work about, and you've referenced like an art market in relationship to your work a couple times now. And so I'm curious how you do see that, like, the women who were murdered, if a piece sells?
I don't sell those pieces. I
Okay.
have really strict rules around what sells.
So I was curious if you could elaborate on how you deal with all of these
I will not
issues.
sell to collections that are funded by Israeli arms dealers, for example. I will not. And you, as an artist, you want to make money. Like, it's really nice. Like, all of those pieces into oblivion, like, there's a reason that, at first when the gallery started showing them, they're like, Sheida, these aren't selling. And I was like, yeah, let's not sell them. Because these aren't, like, I believe in having difficult conversations around the dinner table. Like, if you were to come to my house, you'd see a poster done by the Artworkers Coalition of the My Lai Massacre hanging above my dining room table, because I think it's important to have discussions about difficult things. But that doesn't mean that I think that bodies should be traded and sold in this economy. And so when I'm selling pieces like this image of my parents to like the Guggenheim, I know where their money comes from, but I also think that there's this language of consent around it. There's nothing exploitative here, and there's like the conversation with my parents who are living subjects and asking them if they're comfortable with that. So it's definitely always about, and not all artists do that, but I think for me, like having discussions about those things. Like, my gallery knows that if there is someone interested in a sale, they always come to me and they say, hey, Sheida, this person's interested in your work. What do you think? And I'm like, okay, well, who are they? Like, let's get on an email with them. Let's have a conversation. And that means that I make less sales. But I will say the majority of my sales are not to collectors. They're to institutions and museums where the work will be protected and storage somewhere. But, at least protected. I can hear you for sure. Oh, okay.
Oh, they have to record it. Excuse me, recording. Sheida, thank you so much. It's very nice to hear from you. This is not a fully formed thought, so forgive me.
You're good.
It's a two-parter. So one, as a revolutionary maker, would you say that lens-based media is, as this group divulges, we have a very hard time talking about photography in the words of like voyeurism.
Of course.
We have a hard time talking about it in terms of communities of color and how it's represented. How do you feel about coming to spaces like this, number one, and talking about the work, especially not only as an educator, but as a person? That's my first part, and then I'll get into the second.
So what does it mean to be talking at a photography conference?
Yes.
Okay. I think my challenge is always thinking about, what is photography and how are photographers framed, right? Most of the world frames, the camera as this truth-telling device. We all know as photographers that there's this violence inherent to our language, like shooting and taking. We know the history of photography is violent. We want to tell stories, but I don't believe in personally, I don't believe in photojournalistic storytelling, because I believe that it strips the, individuals in the photos of their autonomy. It goes back to thinking about so cool is the body in the archive. But what does it mean to create or develop relationships with your subjects, especially if those subjects are individuals that are from communities of color, because they are still put on a pedestal for the gaze of the other. They always will be. We always will be, right? But at the end of the day, if we don't make those images, they're not going to be seen either. What does it mean to put images of our communities into circulation? Who are they for? How are they accessed? How are they touched? How are they viewed? There's always going to be a voyeuristic way that white folks are going to look at images of individuals of color and consume them, without a doubt. I don't think that's ever going to change. I think the question for the artist is, how are you presenting it? How do you want to present it? In what context do you want to present it? Or do you not want to? Do you want to make it in a place that's only accessed by people that you feel like are worthy of accessing it? Or is there a way to challenge, those white viewers? Oftentimes those viewers are collectors that want to collect the body of the other, which really isn't that different than individuals like white collectors collecting images of lynchings and holding on to them, right? So if we're thinking about this idea of collecting and photography and economy, it's really comes back to who are we individually and what are our comfort levels and our bases. I don't think that this conversation is ever really going to shift or change. It's about how you personally navigate it and how you push back. Does that make sense? Or does that answer
Yes.
the question?
Yes, it does. And my second part is I wanted to know a little bit about the legacy of your archive. So I feel that you have so much greatness that is shared, and having the ability to have not only a legacy in drawings and words and memory from your parents. I'm just curious as to what you think about this work for the future. And
Yeah, I mean, the archive, I guess, is really important, right? Because, I don't know, I'm really interested, I guess I'll backtrack. I'm so interested in magical realism, and that's something I didn't really talk about in this work. I'm really interested in how an archive is supposedly finite, right? They're objects, they give us information, we look at them, we analyze them, we could place them within timeline or history. And a photograph, we could maybe make a world around, but like sometimes, you know, we have someone that'll tell us more, or there's information on the back. But I'm interested in magical realism as this kind of form of scrambling time. Scrambling the archive. I think one of the most kind of notable and easy, you know, things like pieces to think about are Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. Obviously, magical realism as a genre is just like phenomenal, but that's probably the book that a lot of people know. And in this book, you know, there's this movement between jumping between the past and the present and the future, back to the present, back to the future, back to the past, and nothing is stable, nothing is fixed. And I think so much about archives are fixed. How do we catalog them? How are they arranged? Who has access to them? Are they in libraries? Are they housed in shoe boxes under your bed? Are they in your grandmother's attic, you know? And I think thinking about the origin of the archive and the trace of who's organizing the archive is really important to me. My archive is still shared between myself and my parents, and we kind of trade our archive back and forth. Sometimes my mom will miss it, and she'll be, next time you come home, can you bring that letter home? I haven't seen it in a long time. And so there's this kind of passing back and forth. And that builds this like tradition of oral history, or this tradition of layering that I'm really interested in. So I think the archive, I guess, in that sense is really important to not be this linear, fixed thing that tells us exactly how to think or to behave or to feel. I mean, I see a lot of people that make like family archive work, and it's like, here's a photo of my father or my grandfather when he was at war, and now I've worn the same uniform as him, and I'm recreating that photo of him at war. And it's like, okay, interesting first step. What does that do? What does it mean to inhabit that? What does it mean to cosplay? What does it mean to role play? What does it mean to jump into a role in which maybe you haven't experienced that trauma? Can you method act and learn about what that trauma might be? Can you start having these conversations? Maybe they're not around to have those conversations with anymore. And so then it really becomes about how you're telling the story, and is there a way to do justice to it?
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I had a question about your process with just like making these elaborate sets that are so big for this kind of piece. Does that take you, like, do you put all of your time and effort into one thing at a time, or are you building other sets and making other photographs at the same time?
Usually I have multiple going on at the same time. It's like, because sometimes when you're like working on something, you just can't get it. And like, sometimes I just get so angry that I want to tear it down. I'm like really wildly impatient. And so it's really helpful for me to have multiple things going at the same time. I also think it's really important to say that like, I'm not one of those artists that's in the studio every day. I'm not even in the studio every week. I think so much about making work is researching, coming up with source images, making sketches. I actually draw out like most of my photos. I write lists. I tell Siri to like write lists for me while I'm driving in the car. So I just have like words. I do like Jungian word analysis. I'm not like a Jung fan, but the word analysis thing is like for making work. Anyways, I think, I spend sometimes months on a backdrop if it's big, and days on a backdrop if it's small, or maybe days on a backdrop if it's big. It's really just what kind of energy you're bringing into it, but always multiple pieces at the same time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sheida, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I'm gonna, this is off the top of my head.
Sure.
So with the trauma that you're speaking to, usually with trauma there's grieving,
Absolutely.
and with grieving there's a eulogy. So when I'm seeing the bird images, I'm kind of seeing those as a eulogy to the multiple passings of those life forms.
Yeah.
And I had an American woodcock flying into our sliding glass door one morning. So you should look that up. I didn't even know these were in my neighborhood.
They're freaks.
It's an incredible, incredible bird.
They are.
And I took it to a bird sanctuary that morning, and it passed away. They gave it a number, and it passed away. But I never was able to say goodbye to that. It was just like we dropped it off, and we just hoped for the best.
Yeah.
And there was like this grieving process, like, God, what a loss. What if I had found it sooner, et cetera, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the idea of the eulogy that I'm seeing in your work is, it's almost like writing a recommendation letter to like the higher power. And so your photographs are just sort of speaking on that plane to me, that they're a way for you to kind of work through that grieving, and sharing that with us is really powerful.
Thank you.
And I think it's what you're conveying to us is that we should all get in touch with our trauma.
I think it's important. You know, I was raised, my father's life motto is comfort equals death. And he tells me that grieving is actually a luxury. I don't think a lot of traumatized refugees and immigrants don't have time to grieve, or they don't have the ability or the privilege to process. Grieving is a privilege. It's a luxury, because if you have to work constantly to be able to just get a little bit or to get the next thing, you don't have time to stop and to feel. And I was raised like that. I was just out with a friend of mine who's Iranian last night, who's here, and we were just talking about how we never are calm and how we're always constantly busy. And I think when you're thinking about grieving, it means that you have to stop, and you actually have to think, and you have to feel. And that's something that I don't even know if I fully know how to do yet, because there's always an onslaught of birds that are going to be hitting windows or getting hit by cars that I will continually have to take in and continue to process. And, you know, say, okay, here's another one. I have to jump right back into action. And so I guess, you know, in a sense, like these photographs, I'm interested in this idea of a eulogy. I haven't thought about it this way, but I appreciate that.
I'd also like to thank you for your presentation. It is very powerful.
Thank you.
If I could, I just would like to offer a thought on your last comment about grief.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I'm doing a lot of grief work in my art. And for me, at least, and I hear what you say about grieving being a luxury that a lot of immigrants don't have. They don't have the time. Their lives are too pressing. And grieving can unravel a person.
Oh, 1,000%.
Right? But from my perspective, grieving is also a necessity.
Oh, for sure.
So in some cases, perhaps it's a luxury, but I think it's a necessity, because if we don't grieve, and I can look inside myself about this one, if we don't grieve, we bottle all that stuff up and it leaks out.
Absolutely.
And so I would respectfully suggest that it's also a necessity.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm not saying that like it's a luxury, but it's just how I was raised. I have a therapist, so I grieve with her sometimes. That's how I process it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I would never suggest to anyone that they should not grieve, FYI. I'm just saying my parents are fucking hardcore.
All right. Hi. That was awesome. Thank you. I have a question for you that I recently found myself posing to a room full of captive audience, right? And I wonder what I think it's just general. Do you think that the art space is still a place for discovery?
I mean, personal discovery, sure. Or if you haven't seen a lot of art before, or if you haven't been in like art spaces, or you're going to a museum. And like, I was just talking with a good friend of mine who's a curator, and she goes to a lot of biennials, and she curates a lot of biennials, and she continues to go to them, even though most of them fucking suck, because there's this chance, this glimmer, that maybe you'll discover something. And every once in a while you do. And it's like a good drug, you know, like every time you're like, oh my God, I'm seeing this piece and it's changing my mind. Like people that know me probably know that I'm like a critical bitch. And it's really hard for me to like something, because I'm always finding the problems with it before I can enjoy it, which is not a great, place to be. But I think that the art space is definitely still a potential for discovery, especially because the art world's so obsessed with finding like the next young artist that there's always going to be younger artists that are shown and that are like circulating, and that type of discovery is still exciting too. But don't do it for like the collector that wants to like have the like art conquest thing either. But yeah, no, definitely. I'm not like, I mean, I'm really cynical, but there's a sliver of hope in there.
If I can, do you think it still functions like that, though? Like, genuinely, do you think that you enter an art space and people are geared towards discovery, or are they? No.
Absolutely not. I mean, do you think anyone actually goes to an opening to see the fucking art? It's a pageant. You go after the opening. You go to the opening to show face and show support and be there and talk to people. When you actually want to discover the work, you go when there's no one there. You sit with it. You spend time with it. If you actually care about this idea of discovery, you don't just show up and give something. I mean, like, our attention spans are so fucking fast, right? Like we don't stay with anything. We're constantly scrolling. Our hands are swirling over like images constantly. We touch them, we grab them, we swipe on them, but we don't stay with them. And I think there's this, what has staying power? Well, nothing's going to have staying power unless you stay with it and you spend time with it. So I really put that back on, do I think the art space is it possible, and is that real? I think it's real if the people that are visiting the art space put the time into it. It's not the space's fault, it's the people's fault. Here we are again, you asking me a question.
I have a question for Sheida. So related to the grieving comments, which I found really insightful, I'm thinking about, it always strikes me about your work how like this what marks trauma in part and pain is like this incommunicability of it. And part of, at least what I see in images, is you get to go beyond language and words. But I'm curious for you, like I think of your mom's drawings and things like this as different ways of processing, right? But I'm curious for you if pictures speak, and if there's a pictorial language, or if you're thinking like that, or are they distinct for not speaking?
I think these are the first ones that are for me, which is why I can't stop making them. I actually haven't had like an insatiable appetite for making images in a very long time, and these are the ones that I keep making, and they're so fucking stupid. Like, they're simple. Like, they're just like photos of me and my exam table with my camera, like taking these like clips of these patients. And it's kind of like my mom's version of her drawings. She's trying to like grasp onto something, or grasp onto a memory, and to tell that memory. And I'm sitting here trying to process the fact that I'm holding this in my hands as it's dying, or that I'm watching this hatch but then it dies, or I'm like looking at this bird who's hit a window so hard that all of his feathers have come off, or this bird who's been pesticides have made him blind and he has birth defects. This one has a back injury. This one's an oil spill. I mean, it's relentless. So the drawings and the photos, I guess like my mom's drawings and these photos are similar. I've been thinking a lot about passing them back and forth with her. She's always like asking me to send her photos of dead birds, because she's been making these like weird clay sculptures of my dead bird photos, and I kind of want her to make drawings of the dead bird photos and kind of passing them back and forth. I don't know what that means yet. I don't know what any of this work means, because it's not, I just know that it makes me feel something, and that's something I haven't had in a while.
What is the feeling?
It feels like this compulsion, because of, I mean, like, we've all seen really bad environmental artwork, right? Like those photos of like animals split open with like plastic coming out of their guts, and you're like, oh my God, that's so awful. Or like Edward Bertinsky's like fucking monotonous like landscapes of like, like the trauma that's done to the earth when we're like digging for, whatever we make electric car batteries out of. I mean, like, the world is fucked, and I see it constantly. But I think this obsessive nature of photographing and recording is something that I've never experienced in real time before. Maybe like in Levers of Power, when like I'm kind of like recording all of those political events that are happening in Iran, like as PS 752 gets shot down, or as COVID's happening, I'm recording these political moments, but these feel like quiet deaths that no one gets to see, and maybe it's a little photojournalistic. I don't know. Yeah, it feels compulsive. And I don't think they look anything else like my other work, but I like how they look, and I don't know why. They're not done yet, obviously. These are just like, they're going to be layered into things. I don't fucking know what they're going to do. But thanks for that. Yeah, let's go eat and hang.
All right. I'm sorry.
Go for it. I'm not going to say no.
So I had a question about you being in academia. So at the start, you said that you kind of had a distaste for it, and
Yep.
now you're in academia. So are you participating in it because you want to be kind of the voice that you never had?
Absolutely. I mean, like, every year I have like one like queer student. Fuck, what a Freudian fucking slip. I'm like, my birds are my patients, my students are my patients. One like queer student that's like, or like one student that has like some family history that's intense, and they come to me and like it feels like I can work with them, and it makes it feel worth it because they have someone that can understand or see who they are in some capacity. I don't think I teach to make myself feel good though, for any means. You know, I think a lot of people do. A lot of people go into academia because it makes them feel important. I mean, look at all the like tenured profs that haven't fucking like changed their presentations for decades. They're living like cush lives teaching the same shit and not like actually like reconditioning themselves or keeping up with what's happening in society. And so while I hate academia, I still participate because people like queer folks and people of color need to exist in those spaces. Like, what happens when we're not there? Who's there for those students? I don't know.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And my queer patients, I guess. I have to really think about that one. That was rough. On that note.